All right, we are live. Welcome everyone to this live stream. Thanks so much for watching. Thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible and make awesome interviews with awesome guests like Dr. Andy Bannister possible. Some of you who follow the channel may recognize him from a couple of months ago. He was here with us and he thought he was getting off easy with just one appearance, but we showed him, we got him back a second time.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. And so he's back again. Andy Bannister is the director of the Solis Center for Public Christianity. He speaks and teaches regularly throughout the UK, Europe, Canada, the USA, and the wider world. Andy holds a PhD in Islamic Studies and is an adjunct research fellow at the Arthur Jeffrey Center for the Study of Islam at Melbourne School of Theology and is also adjunct faculty at Wycliffe College, University of Toronto. And most importantly for this interview, he is the author of the upcoming book, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? Check the description box for links to Andy's website and to his upcoming book. You can buy it from all kinds of places. So be sure to check that description box out after we're finished. Andy, so glad to have you. Welcome back.
Well, great, Colin. It's great to be back on the channel. I couldn't figure out whether you kindly invited me back because you thought, hey, it was great having Andy, let's get him again, or because I made such a mess of it last time, you thought we'll give the guy a chance to just, fix all the errors from last time. But, one of those two is fine.
You're in the same category as Dr. Nickel, back by popular demand. People like your approach and like your communication. So we'll put it like that, back by popular demand. I do want to let the audience know that we'll be taking some questions towards the end. I have this habit of getting guests on who are a lot smarter than I am, and so it takes every brain cell I have to engage in conversation with them. So I'll watch the live chat a bit, but I'll mostly focus on Andy as we go through this discussion. Andy, I wanted to give you a chance again. We did this last time, but I didn't realize the resources you have on Solis. So could you please introduce that to the audience? There's a link in the description box also for, of course, the site, but then your page for your book. So can you introduce us to Solis and talk about the resources there?
Yeah, that's very kind of you to give me that chance. So solas, and solas is the Scottish word, the Gaelic word for sunrise, for sunlight, and we like the kind of imagery in that. And so we're a small Christian organisation based in Scotland, but covering the whole of the UK and increasingly dabbling in other parts of the world too, especially in this kind of COVID era where everyone's online anyway. And we really specialise in two things at Solas. One is taking the gospel, the message of Jesus, out of the walls of the churches and into places where people who don't have a Christian faith hang out. And, when we're not in a coronavirus pandemic, that's often places like universities, workplaces, cafes, clubs, restaurants, pubs, coffee shops, the list goes on and on and on. These days, most of that's online. And then we also help train and equip and resource Christians and how to share their faith with their friends at home, at school, at work, and so forth, the natural kind of way. And as well as the in-person or sort of online kind of virtual in-person stuff, that we do, Colin, as you kindly pointed out, there's the Solas website, and there's a link in the show notes for this. And you go to the Solas website, there are literally now, after sort of 5 or 6 years, hundreds, if not even thousands of resources there. We've got something called our short answer videos, where we take a common question about the Christian faith, and myself or a colleague, we filmed 4, 5, 6 minute answers. It's most of the common ones, very sort of seeker friendly. So if you're a Christian watching this and you've got something you want to share with a friend who's not a Christian, or you're watching this and you don't have a Christian faith, but you've got a question, something you're intrigued about, those videos are really helpful. We've got a podcast, Pep Talk, the Persuasive Evangelism podcast, designed to help, again, just equip Christians share their faith naturally with their friends. And then we've got loads of articles and blog posts and essays and book reviews and you name it. And everything on the website's free. So if you see anything you like, you don't have to ask our permission. If it's a blog article, please feel free to reshare it, reblog it. If it's a video, feel free to download it, play it in your church, stick it on your own YouTube channel. All of that's fine. All we ask is you just put a kind of little link back, spread it back to the Solas website so people can at least see where it's come from. But other than that, those are all just resources there to help people think about the Christian faith and discover who Jesus is, or discover how, if they are Christians, how they can do that in a more winsome, engaging way.
And you also started a podcast recently, and I can't think of the name of it. But
oh, there are no secrets on the on the internet, Colin. Yes, so myself and two friends, Michael Lotz, who's another apologist and evangelist in the UK. We've been friends for years, and a friend of mine called Aaron Edwards, who is a lecturer at Cliff College, which is a small theological college in the UK. We've been friends again for years, and we used to, before COVID, have these massively long conversations over coffee and beer and so forth. Then it moved online, and then finally we thought, hey, let's try recording some of these interactions and seeing whether it would make a podcast. And lo and behold, it sort of worked. So we launched a podcast 6 weeks ago, which at the moment is called, well, we can't work out whether we want to call it the podcast that has with no name yet, or Three Men in a Podcast. But we have been having a little competition with our listeners to come up with a better name. And the little secret is we do actually have now a crackingly good name that a New Zealand friend of ours suggested that we're going to unveil on the next episode. But we've been really pleased, actually. What we do in that podcast, and the best way to folks to find it is find me on Facebook. Just look up Andy Bannister. I regularly share links to it. It's experimenting with the format. But basically what we like to do, Colin, is take perhaps a contemporary issue, be it the media, church and law and society, culture. We've got stuff coming up on social media and parenting and education, and really just kick it around from a Christian perspective, because there's lots of podcasts that do that from a more secular perspective, but we wanted something to do that in a kind of generous, engaging way. You know, Michael and Aaron and I were great buddies, but we don't think the same on everything. So there's a bit of banter, a bit of digging into issues, and we're quite surprised. The first, by the time we got to the sort of fifth episode, we've got about 400 or 500 listeners coming out, which we never expected. We thought like maybe 4 people would listen, maybe 5, perhaps our wives and our grandparent or 2. But it turns out that people are interested in this stuff. So do check it out. And we'd love your feedback as well from folks listening to this. It's very much early days. And if it's useful to people, we'll keep doing it. And the day it isn't useful or it gets boring, the day we'll stop.
Awesome. I see Blackjack in the live chat. Blackjack, thanks for your super chat and for your contributions here to the channel. Andy, earlier today, I searched, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God in YouTube? And the #1 search result is some guy named Andy Bannister. The video,
really?
I don't know who he is, but the video is on the C.S. Lewis Institute YouTube channel.
Yes.
It was posted 4 years ago and has about 156,000 views. And for those of us who have followed your work, many of us, myself included, I'm sure, were not surprised to see that you have a book coming out called Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? It seems like for many of us, I'm sure, that you've been on a trajectory to write this book for a very long time. Does it feel that way for you?
Yeah, it does, and it's really interesting. I don't hang out on YouTube much. So I've got small children. I don't have time for that kind of thing. But it's interesting that that's had the traction it has, Colin, because actually that's where it begins. And in the acknowledgement section for this new book, at the end, I talk about that. So the backstory to this book was, I think it was late 2016, possibly 2017. It must be 2016 that originally we did it. I had a phone call from a friend of mine called KJ, who was the Chicago director of the C.S. Lewis Institute. We've been friends for a while. I was still living in Canada at this point. And he said, hey, Andy, we'd love to get you to come down to Chicago and do an event with this title. And I remember sort of foolishly saying, seriously, are you going to get an audience? Is there not something more interesting, than perhaps the use of the vowel in Serbo-Croat poetry from the 19th century or something? And he went, no, you think this is the one? Because it was around the time this question was getting cultural traction. Miroslav Volf, well-known Christian theologian, had begun talking about this and eventually published a book on the subject. There was a professor at Wheaton College, a well-known American Christian theological college, who'd come out and made lots of waves saying she thought it was the same God. And he said, I think there will be traction. He said, I reckon we'll get 100, 150 folks to the lecture. And Americans are not, you guys are not known for understatement, but he underestimated wildly, because we got about 600, 700. I remember coming away from that event thinking, oh, this is something interesting. And so I then began adding it to the roster of kind of seminars and talks that I do. And everywhere I would go over the next few years, and right down to the present day, when I'm booked for a conference or something, and people say, what are some of the topics you can offer, perhaps as breakouts or so forth. And I mentioned this one, whenever it's on the conference roster, that's the most popular session. So when about 18 months ago, I was thinking it was time to write again, I remember thinking, well, maybe this is the one to go for. And I pitched it to a couple of publishers, and the answer was positive. So basically, this book came out of that talk back there for the C.S. Lewis Institute, and I've been thinking about it and chewing it over and reflecting on it certainly for the last 4 to 5 years. But I think, and this comes out in the book, I think actually this is the result of 20, 25 years of thinking. That's how long I've been dialoguing and engaging with Muslim friends and academics and so forth. And I think so many of the great discussions between Christians and Muslims actually come back to this topic of who is the identity of God. So yeah, there's been sort of several decades of sort of thought has gone into this, hopefully.
There was a question in the live chat before we started that was effectively, this question seems so ridiculous. But really, as you mentioned, there are some over time who have suggested that the answer to this question is yes. We have things like the Insider Movement, and we have the Quran itself, which bases claims for its authority and the authority of its messenger on continuity with the Torah and the Gospel. So, allegedly at least, the Quran would answer yes to this question. And this brings up a tension that we may get into later on of the Quran, which claims continuity with the Torah and the Gospel, but so many Muslims today trying to get away from the Torah and the Gospel because of the problems that the claimed relationship of the Quran has with them. In the beginning sections of your book, you talk about some Muslim friends that you had growing up. And so it seems like you've been interacting with Muslims effectively all of your life to some extent. In your experience, what is their answer to this question? Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God?
Yeah. Well, let me come into that, Colin, by the point you made that I think you said somebody in the chat had sort of suggested that, you know, in some ways it's a ridiculous question. It's been really interesting since we started the social media campaign for the book, which I think kind of officially kind of launches on Thursday. I lose track of where we are. To go, I've had a lot of people sort of effectively imply on social media, well, hang on, why do we need the book? It's a one-word answer. But the funny thing is, you get two opposite answers. You get those at one end of the theological spectrum who are like, well, it's obviously yes, right? Or some of my secular kind of liberal friends, it's obviously yes. Or some of my Muslim friends, obviously yes. And then you get, you know, quite a lot of enthusiastic Christians who, well, it's obviously no. And I find it interesting that both camps think the answer is obvious, which tells me there's a discussion to be had. And to both sides, well, it's obviously those who think it's yes. I don't think it is, which is why I've written the book. But to those who say, well, it's obviously no, I go, well, yeah, but of course the question is then, why is it no? And, you know, living in a house with 2 small children, if all goes well, you won't see them. But if all goes badly, they'll burst through the door at some point. I've got a 5-year-old and 8-year-old. And trust me, if I say to my 5-year-old, no, he doesn't go, oh, that's okay. Whatever I've said, no, he'll always go, but why, Dad?
Why?
And that's important. And as Christians, we need to be able to answer the why. So the people who say the answer is obviously no, I think actually, yeah, they're onto something. But then what do you say to a Muslim friend or a secular friend or, you know, even another Christian friend who goes, yeah, but why is the answer no? And this is what the book tries to do, I think, is really to give more flesh to that. But yeah, thinking back to my high school days, which was where I begin in the book. I mean, what's interesting, Colin, I talk in the book about when I was maybe 13, 14, and, you know, one of my best friends at high school was a Muslim. We hung out together quite a lot. And I think partly for a number of reasons. One is we were both religious. And so we sort of, those of us who were religious like clubbed together, you know, in sort of, you know, as sort of safety in numbers from the larger atheist contingent. And, you know, I guess in my mind, you know, my friend Ahmad and I were largely similar. He went to mosque, I went to church, believed in Muhammad, I believed in Jesus. You know, I read the Bible, he read the Quran. And it seemed like these categories just lined up and just the words were different. And it wasn't until a little bit later, after I'd left school and begun, you know, later on in my 20s, dialoguing more seriously with Muslims I'd met in London, that I began to discover, oh my gosh, there are actually some big differences. And yeah, there are some surface similarities, but big differences. But I think many of my Muslim friends, I think if I'd asked my friend Ahmed when I was 13, 14, what did he think? If I asked many Muslim friends I know today, particularly those at the more sort of moderate, sort of liberal end, who haven't really thought their faith through, they're just, you know, they're just practicing, but they haven't really thought about it. I think they'd assume, well, I guess the answer is yes, largely for the reasons that you alluded to, that that's sort of what the Quran implies, that the Quran seems to imply and suggest that, you know, Muhammad is a prophet in the same line as all the biblical prophets. The Quran comes in the same line of scriptures as the New Testament and the Torah, and that really, you know, Islam is a kind of sister religion and the culmination of that sort of, you know, trend that's gone through Judaism and Christianity. Now, even the Quran, though, we may come to this as the interview goes on, the conversation goes on. Of course, even the Quran then has a sting in the tail, because the Quran, of course, denies the crucifixion, which is a pretty central, fact in the New Testament. Denies the crucifixion, and of course, the Quran pretty strongly attacks the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, the understanding that Jesus was more than a man, but actually, in some sense, belonged to the identity of God. And the Quran does attack that. So even though the Quran wants to squeeze the two together, even the Quran itself begins to sort of drive this wedge through and go, yes, but. And of course, many Muslims today have made the but, I think, even bigger.
And regarding your methodology in this book, you ask 4 questions. Is there a God? You're also accommodating atheist readers. And parenthetically, and what is God like? That's the first question. The second question, who and what are human beings? Third, what is wrong with the world? And finally, what's the solution? And you effectively go through the Quran and the Bible and build answers to these questions from them, and then compare and contrast. And I think you probably have more to say about this, but I think it's important to let the Muslim viewers know that you go through your book, and when you draw your conclusions, you're citing Muslim scholars just to show that you're not trying to make something up or to be irresponsible in your interpretation of the Islamic texts.
Yeah, I think that's I just start with those four questions. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to think through, of course, Colin, is when we compare worldviews, how do we do it? If we're comparing Christianity and Islam, or Christianity and atheism, how are some of the ways that we can compare different belief systems? And there'll be various sort of frameworks suggested over the years. And the one that I use in the book is partly my own, partly modified from Tom Wright, who's a well-known kind of Christian philosopher and theologian. And exactly, it's those 4 questions that you described. And the great thing is about those 4 questions: is there a God? And if so, what's he like? What does it mean to be human? What's gone wrong? What's the solution? Is you can put them to any worldview, and you can put them to atheism. And of course, although atheists say there is no God, they still have to think about questions 2 through 4. And they're great questions. Those are great questions I found over the years to get conversations flowing when you meet somebody of a different faith. And it occurred to me a few years ago that actually that's a great way to compare Islam and Christianity. And of course, if Christianity and Islam, if it is the same God, you'd expect the answers to be broadly similar. And what I found fascinating is the talk that you mentioned that I did for the C.S. Lewis Institute all those years ago and is on YouTube. I really, in that talk, just explored the who is God question. And it didn't take me long to come to the conclusion, when you look at the Quran and the Bible, how those scriptures answer that question. There's very, very different pictures of God that emerge. But then for writing this book, I sat down and looked very hard at questions 2, 3, and 4. What do the Quran and the Bible say it means to be human? What do the Quran and the Bible say has gone wrong with humanity, with creation, and so forth? And what do the Quran and the Bible say is the solution to that? And those answers differ wildly. They're wildly different. But they flow from the first question. Who you think God is has a big impact on what you think the nature of a human being is. It has a big impact on what you think is the problem with the world. It has a big issue of what you think, big impact on what you think's gone solution is. And so Islam and Christianity look further and further apart. And as I say, and we'll come back to this hopefully as we go through the conversation, I also want to stress right at the beginning of our time together, especially also for Muslim readers, in doing this, I'm absolutely not trying to denigrate Islam or the Quran so much as actually put it in its right place. Because one of my concerns is if you squish Islam and Christianity together and you simply assume that Muslims are like Christians but with beards and burqas, the problem is that you do a massive injustice to the Quran. You try and read the Quran through a Christian lens. You try and squeeze it into a Christian mold, and it isn't. It's very, very different. And you do it much greater justice, I think, if you approach the Quranic text and say, okay, what does the Quran say God is like? Let's put the Bible on one side for him. What does the Quran say? What does the Quran say is the nature of a human being? What's gone wrong and what the solution is? And I think that's very important in Muslim and Christian interaction, that we don't try and mold each other into the other's position, but we let them be different. Let Islam be Islam. Let Christianity be Christianity. And then let's learn to talk together about what we believe, where the differences are, not being afraid of them. And then push into the question, well, which is true? Because those differences are profound, and you are led inexorably to the conclusion they can't both be right.
Yeah, I appreciate that approach, that attempt to take an honest, objective look. That you take that approach. Gordon Nickel, Mark Dury, you are all very focused on looking at the Quran on its own terms, and and that's important. And I would invite our Muslim friends to do the same. A lot of the interaction I get, of course, being the more of the polemical type, is to view the Bible through the lens of Muslim polemics, unfortunately.
Mm.
As we go through the first question, I picked a subheading out of that section I'd like to talk about. The first question is, there a God, and what is God like? And you talk about the God of the Bible being relational. One thing I appreciate about the topics that you select in the book and your treatment of the biblical text is that you're selecting meta-narratives. These are things that go from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible. You're not picking topics and proof texting using a verse or two with some sort of a questionable translation. But one thing that you mention under your section about God being relational, the God of the Bible being relational, is that he dwells with his people. And so we see this in the ancient temple motif of Genesis 1. We see it in the tabernacle. We see it in the temple throughout the history of Israel. We see it in Jesus. We see it in the church, and we see it in Revelation. The dwelling place of God is with man. And you quote that verse from Revelation 21. So you say that the biblical theme of God's relationality appears at the beginning of history, creation. It appears in the middle of biblical history in the person of Jesus, and it also appears at the end of history in the Bible's highly relational language of what our eternal future will be like. The Quran is quite different. You say, in short, for the Quran, Allah is distant at the beginning of history, not walking with Adam and Eve, nor covenanting with Abraham. There you're drawing from examples that you used prior. He is absent in the middle of history, not coming in the person of Jesus, and is missing from the end of history. Heaven has pleasures, but it lacks God's presence. And I do wonder sometimes if this transcendence of Allah that we see in the Quran and in Islamic theology results in some of the other things that we see from a Christian perspective, which are very curious: the veneration of Muhammad, the ritualistic practices at the Kaaba, and these sorts of things. It seems that we are, if the pandemic has taught us anything, relational, and we seek a relationship. And if our religion doesn't provide that relationship with God, then we seek it elsewhere.
Gosh, there's a huge amount in there to respond to, Colin. So I'll just pick up on two or possibly three pieces. First thing I want to say is actually the reason that I picked those categories when I look at the nature of God in that chapter, and I look at absolutely relationality that you've picked up on, but also that God can be in the Bible, can be known. He's a God who's holy. He's a God who has suffered, and he's a God who is love. Is that one of the mistakes that Christians sometimes make here is to come in and say, well, clearly it's not the same God, because Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Muslims don't. Therefore, it's not the same God, because the God of the Quran has no son, and the God of the Bible has a son. And I say that's all very well. I said that's a good answer insofar as it goes. It just commits one little minor problem. If we're not careful, we end up chopping off our Jewish friends. And I think any answer to this question that ends up concluding that Judaism is not yearning after or seeking to follow the God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament, I mean, the God of the Old Testament, God of the New are the same, has a huge problem. And, we can't get around the fact that, the Old Testament figures, for example, didn't know Jesus by name. We could talk about the fact that maybe Abraham there at the Oaks of Mamre in Genesis met the pre-incarnate Christ. But it's a bit of a stretch to start building huge sort of theologies around that. But if I take the approach that I've done and say, the God of the Bible in Old and New Testament, almost every page is relational, can be known, is holy, is love, suffered. The great thing is those are massive biblical themes in both Old and New Testament. They're themes that our Jewish friends would affirm as well. They reach their fulfillment and their absolute, sort of zenith in biblical theology in the person of Jesus, but they're missing there in the Quran. So it gives us a much firmer, wider base than simply doing what Christians sometimes do and going, oh, the answer is always Jesus, which we love to do as Christians. Whatever the question, the answer is Jesus. That's not a bad place to start, but sometimes we need to get a little bit further as the first thing. But in the relationality piece, yeah, I absolutely, think that's foundational. And I remember when it first struck me, the fact that it's not just that almost on the very first page of the Bible, Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is relational. There in the garden, walking and talking with Adam and Eve in close relationship. He's relational on almost the very last page of the Bible, Revelation 21, which you mentioned that I quote, walking and talking with his people in the new heavens and the new earth. And of course, and the central event of God's dealing with humanity, coming in the person of Jesus, relationality at the heart of it. So not only is this massive biblical theme, what's fascinating, Colin, is those three touch points: creation, Jesus, and the afterlife. Those are three things the Quran talks about, and they're among the elements that the Quran has picked up and borrowed through oral tradition from the Bible. And in every case, it deliberately chooses, I think, as it conforms those stories to its emerging theology, to downplay or rip out relationality. So Allah in the Quran does not walk and talk in the garden with Adam and Eve. He doesn't have that sort of that close intimacy of relationships. He's not there at the burning kind of bush speaking to Moses and revealing his own personal name as he does in Exodus 3. And although that story turns up in the Quran, Jesus, of course, turns up in the Quran. But any sense that he is, God revealing himself is gone. He's just another prophet, just another bringer of morality and law. And of course, in paradise, or the view of heaven in the Quran, what is striking is the absence of God. There's all these sort of amazing sort of hedonistic pleasures laid out in the Quran: rivers of wine, bitter fruit, crystal clear fountains of water, young virgins for the men to enjoy. All of these things described, but nowhere does the Quran talk in these beautiful, intimate terms about Allah being there, dwelling with his people. So that framework of relationality is fascinating, because I think, as you say, it sums up the meta theme. It's an overarching theme in the Bible. It gets to the heart of who Jesus was, and it's so radically different there in the Quran. And as you observed, Muslim theologians talk about this. So on the relationality theme, Shabir Akhtar, who is a very well-known Muslim theologian in the UK, based at Oxford University, lovely guy, met him many occasions, brilliant thinker, very clear. And Shabir, so a Muslim, Orthodox Sunni Muslim, says Muslims do not see God as their father. Men are servants of a just master, but cannot, in Orthodox Islam, typically attain any greater degree of intimacy with their creator. In other words, they're just slaves. And that's the radical difference, or one of the radical differences, between the view of God in the Bible and the view of God in the Quran.
Heaven is a very interesting example because, as you said, you pick the topic. For example, the God of the Bible is relational, and you can look at what that actually looks like in the Old Testament versus the New Testament. Muslims could say something like, well, God's relational status looks different in the Quran. It was revealed at a different time, or something of that sort. But certainly it seems that at creation, and then in particular heaven, the afterlife, these views, if it is the case that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, that these views would have to converge. And heaven should be the great equalizer. It's just in the Quran, Allah and his people. And if we're going to see the theology of the Bible and the Quran align anywhere, it should be there. It's a more, I think, objective sampling of what it looks like for Allah to relate to his people. But the descriptions of heaven in the Quran have always troubled me very much, and I'm not sure how Muslims really deal with that. Not only the lack of relationship with Allah in the afterlife, but also, of course, the treatment of women and the other pleasures that are mentioned.
Yeah,
there.
I agree with you, and I think the other thing as well that's troubled me for a long time, and one of the joys of writing the book was the chance to go into it. Was firstly, of course, the much richer view of the afterlife or the age to come in the Bible, because sometimes those who don't know the Christian faith sort of assume that all religions are designed to get you to heaven. Well, of course, that's not the New Testament view. The New Testament concept is a new heavens and a new earth. The whole of creation, heaven and earth, is going to be remade and renewed and restored in and through what God has done in Christ. And then heaven and earth are going to be united. And then those who have been followers of Christ will then have this amazing eternity of walking and talking in close relationship with God, learning more and more and more about him every day, just walking in that close relationship and intimacy that Adam and Eve had in the beginning. And my word, that is a much bigger idea than simply going to some party in the sky when you die. Islam does really have the party in the sky view when you die. And I think that's problematic for a number of reasons. One is that it's rather odd that God sort of isn't present in heaven, in paradise. in the Quran in any kind of meaningful way. But then the other problem that began to trouble me, Colin, and I thought about this for years and then really dug into it in the book, is what on earth happens when you get bored? Because the Quran talks about, wine, women, and food, and look, those are great earthly pleasures. I've sort of got a fairly strong Anglican leanings, so I do like a bottle of wine. I've been married for 22 years, so I have 2 children, and I think that sex is one of God's good gifts. And I love food, and if my wife were listening to this, she'd say rather too much, which is why she has me on a diet at the moment. Those are 3 great pleasures, but the point is they're finite. However nice the vintage of the wine, by the time you've had a certain number of bottles, it's sort of lost its allure. Sex is one of God's great creations, great gifts to us. We're talking 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000, 100,000, a million, no end in sight, just the same treadmill, more like a hamster wheel, if you like, going round and round with the same pleasures. And food, again, it's lovely, but it's sort of, it's a diminishing returns. And one of my concerns in Islam is what happens if you get bored. And in fact, in the book, I reference as one of my favorite episodes of the American TV show from the 60s, The Twilight Zone. It plays with that idea and tells the story of this sort of fairly low-level kind of mob figure gangster who dies and wakes up in what he thinks is heaven. And it's wonderful at first because everything he wants is on tap. The food is great, the wine is great, he snaps his fingers and women throw themselves at him. But after a month or so, this is beginning to get bored. And finally, he turns to the sort of guardian angel who's, watching over him and says, look, I think something's gone wrong. I wasn't supposed to come here. I've lived a terrible life. I should be in the other place. I'm finding this boring. I want to go to the other place. And his angel companion looks at him and says, have you not figured it out? This is the other place. And the whole episode plays on the fact that hell is actually just getting everything that you ever wanted and nothing else beside. And I think it might have been Oscar Wilde, the playwright, who famously said that the greatest tragedy in a person's life is not when they're weary of suffering, but when they're weary of pleasure. And I think that is a massive issue for the Islamic concept of paradise that isn't there for the Bible's view, because the key idea at the heart of the Bible's view of the afterlife, the age to come, is relationship with God, who is eternal and infinite. And every day that goes by in the new heavens and the new earth, there'll be something more to learn, because you and I will never be able to outgrow what we can discover as we walk closer and closer and fall more and more in love with our Heavenly Father and Lord and Creator and King. And those 2 visions of paradise, quite frankly, the Islamic one terrifies me. It's like a living hell. The Christian one, I can't wait to go. It's just incredibly exciting. I can't wait to walk and talk with my Lord again.
Yeah, Quranic paradise really shows you what paradise may look like without a relational God. That relationship part is completely removed. The second question you ask, who and what are human beings? And we mentioned this briefly. You quote Colossians 1, the Son is the image of the invisible God. And here you tap into yet another biblical meta-narrative. I'll just review some text for our viewers. Son and image language, of course, recalls Genesis 1:26 and 27. And that recalls Genesis 5:3. There, Adam fathers a son in his own image and likeness. And so you have son and image closely connected. This is no doubt what Luke is tracking on at the end of his genealogy in chapter 3, where he calls Adam the son of God. Israel is referred to as God's firstborn son, Exodus 4:22. This is echoed in Hosea 11:1. There are some interesting texts like Deuteronomy 32:18. And there, God is the rock that bore his people. And bore there is the same word that gets translated in the Septuagint for conceive. God fathered or gave birth to his people. In 2 Samuel 7:14, God is the father of the king. So God as a father and his people as his children, Isaiah 1:2 is a great example of that. Children I have born and brought up, or raised, but they have rebelled against me. So the relationship of God and his people as father and children is, once again, another meta-narrative in the Bible. And you mentioned that this is not the case, Andy, in the Quran. I wanted to read a couple of verses. Viewers are probably familiar with verses like 6, 100, and 101, but just on the seriousness of saying that God has a son in the Quran, Surah 23:91, This apparently, God having a son means that there will be some divine conflict. God has not taken a son, nor is there any other God with him. Then each God would indeed have gone off with what he had created, and some of them would indeed have exalted themselves over others. Glory to God above what they allege. And even a more serious verse, or a couple of verses, Surah 1988 through 90, they say, "The merciful has taken a son. Certainly you have put forth something abhorrent." And then this language of cosmic disturbance. The heavens are nearly torn apart because of it, and the earth split open, and the mountains collapse in pieces. So another biblical meta-narrative, God and his people, father and children throughout the Bible. And the Quran never really qualifies its claims that God doesn't have a son, as far as I'm concerned. It's just a flat-out denial of this relationship, which goes back to that first question, the relationship between God and his people, and this biblical notion that we as humans are created in the image of God, and that we have a special relationship with God as his children. Any comments on that?
Well, a whole range of things I think flow out of there, and I think I begin from memory that chapter by saying that I think understanding the conception between God and humanity is hugely important, because the question of who God is and how he relates to us affects so many things. I mean, for example, if you take one way of seeing this is to take step outside Christianity and Islam for a moment. In the book, I use the example of some of the Babylonian creation myths, like Enuma Elish, where the human beings are just created as slaves to the gods. The gods are bored of the work of running the universe, and human beings are created to just kind of allow the gods to kind of sit around and have a nice leisurely life. And aside from being slightly sort of comic, some of those stories, you think if that were true, if that were who human beings were, that has some pretty massive implications for our identity, our dignity, who we are, who we think of ourselves, our place in the universe, and so on. And then we come to Christianity and Islam. And of course, so much, Colin, flows out of that biblical teaching that we as Christians do, we as human beings do bear God's image. We do bear the Imago Dei, as theologians like to use that term, based on Genesis 1:26 and 27. Out of there flow a number of things. Out of there flow, I think why the fall of human beings, why our sin was so severe, and why the whole of creation was damaged. Because when you think about what an image is designed to do, an image is designed to reflect. It's designed to reflect something of its creator. And the same is true of us, that God's intention was that humanity reflect to the rest of creation what God is like. That was a huge responsibility placed upon us. And when human beings rebelled, and when you and I and every one of us have repeated Adam and Eve's sin ourselves in our own lives, that fracture, that damage to creation has spread really widely. And the impact goes back to what it was we were designed to be. And then you flow right the way, I think, into the New Testament. You begin to understand things like, why would God come in the flesh in the person of Jesus? If we're just another animal, just another collection of atoms, no different from aardvarks and ants and plants and so on and so forth. It is interesting quite why you've got the incarnation and the atonement. But you look at a passage like Romans 5:8, which says, God's love is demonstrated in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And you put that together with the image idea, you get the sense of, gosh, God created human beings as pretty incredible, actually, just a little lower than the angels, we're told elsewhere. And that value that's baked into humanity is so important for the rest of the biblical story. And it's not that we're special because we've somehow worked our way up, or got into God's good books by performing something, or have ideas about our station. That was the way we were created, and we were designed for a relationship with God. God created us not just to be slaves, but to be sons and daughters. And so the whole biblical story begins to make sense when you understand that. But more than that, what's interesting? Fast forward to the present day, and so much of our culture and what we care about, Colin, when we think about things like justice and dignity and human rights, hangs on that idea. So take the book, say, by Tom Holland, book Dominion. Tom's a secular historian, wrote this amazing book Dominion about 2 years ago, looking at the impact that Christianity had on the West and civilization as a whole. And as a secular individual, he talks about being incredibly grateful for this idea, excuse me, of human rights and dignity that is wholly and totally grounded on this Christian idea. Men and women bear the image of God and bear value, irrespective of their color, race, creed, gender, background, baggage, earning potential, or so on. And if you throw that idea away, you get into all kinds of problems. And I don't want to go particularly down the rabbit hole of going, well, let's look at some of the human rights abuses that we see in some Muslim countries that have tried to reject that idea and build everything on Sharia. But that is not a comparison that's totally unfair. And then we come to the Quran. And again, the Quran borrows the story of Adam and Eve in the garden and retells it and makes many changes along the way. But one of the changes that's made in its retelling is the idea of human beings bearing God's image is removed. It's not there.